Welcome to New Straits Times Insight, where we'll have a discussion in a more in-depth manner of what the issues that hit the headlines. And today we will be discussing Brexit, impact on the EU and beyond. As people are all aware, Brexit is Britain's decision to get out of the European Union, which has caused a lot of internal turmoil in British politics. At the same time, of course, the decision seems to be irrevocable as a matter of time. And so what will happen to the EU? And what does the EU think about the UK leaving the EU? We will be discussing these issues in greater depth with His Excellency, the Ambassador to Malaysia from Germany, Nicholas Graf Lambsdorff. Welcome, Excellency. And also His Excellency, the French Ambassador to Malaysia, Frederick Loflange. Now, I will start by asking Nikki, if I may, what do you, in more general terms, think of what the impact of Brexit would be on the EU?
Well, thank you, Tansri. It may surprise you and maybe our viewers too, but I try to start with some positive aspects of Brexit. One, I think, is from the EU member states' point of view, rather obvious. The 27 remaining EU member states have been sticking together for years now on the issue of Brexit. In unanimous support and solidarity among us, particularly with Ireland, probably the member state most affected and most directly affected by Brexit. That is actually rare. Usually we fight inside the club, the 27, 20, still 28 members. And it has been going on for quite a long time. Yes, but that's, of course, just the current situation. Politically, in my country, in Germany, Brexit doesn't play a big role anymore. It's not news. A while ago, it reminded me on, as I learned it, the number one rule for diplomats, simple rule, no surprises. Brexit surprised us all and kept surprising us. Not anymore, not really. We will later, I'm sure, talk about the possible consequences of Brexit for our countries, our governments, our businesses. But for the time being, the EU is, of course, affected, and we are very much affected, the German economy, German politics. But it's not really an issue more, it's nothing sensational, and I believe, we will only know afterwards, we are prepared for Brexit.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's still in the headlines, but what Nikki is saying, well, you know, it should not be the headlines, let it happen, and, you know, let it roll, and just. How do you see it from the French perspective?
Very, very similar to what Nikki has just said. I would say we all have been sad that the UK decided to leave the European Union because we were happy with the UK inside. So there has been a lot of sadness. There has been, over the past 3 years since the decision was made, a lot of drama going on, but there is no tragedy. That's part of the game. It's part of the rules of the game. We had the possibility in our European Union treaties to get out of it, Article 50. The UK used it. Okay, now we manage the UK going out. We manage the Brexit. The impact, the economic impact is going to be there. But of course, if you look at the mutual dependency of the 27 remaining member states to the UK economy, it's not very high. About 6 to 7% of our foreign trade, the foreign trade of the remaining 27, is with the UK. If you look the other way around, the UK has between 44% of its exports go to the rest of the EU, and 53% of its imports come from the rest of the EU. So the impact is much bigger. But the final impact will depend on the way we manage and the deals we make with the UK. The drama is not over. We will continue to discuss.
You know, Nicky, you've always said, you know, when we've met privately, you know, that Malaysians, you know, tend to be more Anglophile than they are Europhile, you know, so we know a lot more about so-called consequences on the UK economy, etc., 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 and we read about the political turmoil that has occurred in the UK. Perhaps you could tell us, as you mentioned obliquely just now, what are the economic costs, what could be, you know, the economic costs to the German economy? What other changes will happen to Germany as a result of the UK leaving?
I think the shortest and possibly honest reply would be no one knows. This has never happened before. Mm-hmm. We find it surprisingly difficult to manage that an important member state wants to leave. This was not the idea of the various EU treaties. There are legal provisions, and this is what the UK is using, but we neither know the political nor the real economic or commercial consequences. As concerns the German economy, we do import quite a bit of manufactured, not finished products from the United Kingdom, often for our car industry. That's important. But as Frederick has said, it's even more important for the British companies and economy to be able to export to us.
The parts manufacturers.
Yes, parts, not the finished product, not the car. The car will eventually come from Germany or other places. But they do manufacture absolutely world-class parts, which will be difficult to replace. That is an issue for a number of German companies. Then again, we've had months, if not years, to prepare for this. This has been ongoing. So we believe that the direct economic commercial consequences will definitely be negative, but limited. And in the medium and long term, it's anybody's guess how the British economy will be able to cope with this, and it will not have a major negative effect on our economy.
The German economy is very strong manufacturing, you know, economy. The French are slightly different in terms of composition of economy. How would France be affected? Because both Germany and France actually might gain, you know, from the financial services sector in terms of migration, out-migration from London, you know, to either Frankfurt or Paris. That's one aspect positive to Britain, I mean to France and to Germany. But in terms of your internal economy, the real economy, what would be the impact, France?
The impact is going to be quite limited anyway, because if you look outside the industrial sector, on which we share a lot of what Nicky has just said about Germany, the situation would be roughly the same. If you look at the services, and for example tourism services, which France is quite strong at and attracting a lot of tourists from Britain, this will continue. Nothing is going to impede the flow of tourists from the UK to the rest of the European Union. Things are not going to change. Now we've got to factor in the question of whether there will be a deal or no deal. That's quite important. The no deal situation on the 31st of October, in less than 1 month's time, would be the worst case scenario. But even in this worst case scenario, where suddenly the relationship between the EU and UK becomes based on WTO rules and nothing else, even in this worst case scenario, we would be very quickly starting the negotiation for our next free trade agreement between the UK and the rest of the European Union. We will need that.
Export of wines and so on to the UK.
Well, if in the worst case scenario there would be a tariff and there would be disruption at the border. But you know, we're not so dependent on our exports of wine that we can't wait for a few weeks.
What is your main agricultural export to the UK that would be most affected if it's not?
A lot of agricultural exports indeed to the UK. I think the UK imports almost 2/3 of its food products from outside. But the bulk of exports and imports is still in the industrial sector. We have very strong industrial cooperation. Look at some of our flagship common projects, by the way. Airbus is a project on which you've got Germany, France and the UK on board. And that's one of the things that will continue and be protected by all governments in place.
Who will benefit more from out-migration of financial services from London, as they want to capture the European market? Because you don't allow the settlement of equities and bonds of European assets to occur in London anymore. Would Frankfurt or Paris be catching the benefit? There is competition between Frankfurt and Paris as well. There's no doubt about it.
You've got the two main players there, Frankfurt and Paris. They would benefit, both of them. But honestly, overall, no one benefits from the whole situation. We will get a few more hundreds of people from the banking sector migrating from London to those two places in continental Europe to be able to serve the euro area and the rest of the European Union the way they will not be able to serve it anymore in London. But it will all depend on whether we have a deal or not.
Years ago, I asked experts in the financial industry in Hong Kong, my former poster, who will benefit. And their answer was, without thinking, New York. You don't hear anything from New York, clearly the #1 financial center, international financial center in the world. Yes, there's competition among Paris, Luxembourg, Frankfurt, also Dublin. Maybe I shouldn't say so, but these are all second-tier financial centers. There are only very few leading ones in the world, and that London will remain one of them. London, New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, that's it.
Yeah. Well, everybody else but London. So the thing is, we've not touched, or perhaps we could touch a bit on people, the movement of people, and of course what happens to the 2 million EU citizens in the United Kingdom, largely Polish, I believe, So how would that be sorted out, you think? Again, as Frederick, you said, it depends whether there's a deal or no deal, but there are already some signs about how it might or might not be sorted out. The UK people in EU as well, What do you think will happen on this?
Well, I understand. Currently, the number of EU citizens in London is growing. On a daily basis, we have lines in front of our embassy of people applying for a German passport because they discover German ancestors and they would like to make sure that they remain inside the EU. I have not heard of German citizen leaving England because of Brexit, and I doubt that is going to happen. Not because of Brexit, possibly because life gets more expensive in the UK, depending on what kind of salary you get. The sterling has already lost at least 20% since the Brexit debate started. They predict that it might go down by another 10–15%. That might be a motivator to look for a different place to live, but not so much Brexit, I don't think so.
So you say the economic forces will lead people to move to wherever it's most profitable then?
Probably I'd agree with this. You've got at the moment around 2 to 3 million European Union citizens in the UK and about 1 million UK citizens in the rest of the European Union. Most of our countries have already aligned their policies so that we offer something to the UK citizens who have been staying in our countries for a long time, so that they can continue and stay in our countries. And similarly, the UK is also making the same type of proposals to the European Union citizens. It will depend on each country after Brexit, what the decision will be and how we want to deal with this. But generally speaking, having this influx of European citizens in our countries is quite positive. There are people who will come and consume, work, contribute to the economy. And the same is right on the UK side. If suddenly you cut 3 million people out of the UK population, that's a big problem.
Yeah, this is quite interesting because we talk about the more serious, high-level issues, but you take like football, okay? Malaysians are mad about the English Premier League, and there are so many Europeans playing in English teams in the English Premier League who actually give them strength, success. I mean, for example, the success of Liverpool and the success of Manchester City to enter the European Champions Cup final. It's not a pure UK play, it was a European play. Or in fact, it was a world play, because you open yourselves to the best talents, you get the best talents coming, and they achieve great heights. And so, will these sort of things, like in football, cease to happen? This free movement of people and so on like that? No?
No, this will continue by definition. Football is too important for everyone anyway. Let that be very clear. But by and large, I think my message would be, I said we're sad about what is taking place, but we don't want to forecast a tragedy. It's not going to be a terrible situation, and we are not forecasting that the UK will crumble into pieces. No, it will not happen, and that's not in the interest of the rest of the European Union. Things are going to change a bit, and the degree of change will depend on whether we manage to strike a good deal, and good deals for the future. Because whatever we have on the 31st of October, deal or no deal, the negotiation is not over. There's a new phase in negotiation which will start to decide what the future relationship between the EU and UK be. And we will try on both sides to get the best deal for everyone. So, okay, there's no tragedy about to happen.
Yeah, I think I perfectly understand sometimes, you feel sort of a little distressed. People talk so much about the UK leaving, and then it's going to cost, so much damage to Europe or UK. Now, you take it as something that's going to happen, and life goes on. But I want to ask you about the European idea. The European idea was a great idea, to try and banish war between, France and Germany in particular. You've had big conflicts in the past,
right.
And it was great. It was moving along nicely, and now you have someone falling out of it. Never mind. Are you going to pursue the European idea further? Is this going to be a setback for the European idea? I'm not talking about the real things that happen. Is it going to be a setback for the European idea? What is the next stage in European integration? What do you think will European leadership? You're getting a new commissioner, and so on. There's a new team coming up in Brussels. So what happens next? What are going to be the initiatives, that Europe will pursue?
Now, first of all, to our generation, and certainly, of course, the generation before us, that was the generation that created the European Union or European community. The EU was and still is the most successful peace project ever. That's why I personally have a problem with Brexit. How can you leave such a successful project? But that's happening now. With or without the UK, in or out, that doesn't change. It's still guaranteeing peace among EU member states. When you so that's the present and also the past. When you ask about the future, in the beginning I tried to find some positive aspects of Brexit. For a while there was a debate whether Brexit would cause some kind of a domino effect that others might leave. Look at it now. Absolutely no one is thinking, let alone talking about leaving the EU. But there's a long line of European countries which would love to join the EU rather today than tomorrow. Just ask anybody in former Yugoslavia, or you can ask Ukraine, or even the tiny Republic of Moldova. Everybody wants to join the EU. So the EU is not losing its appeal to others just because the UK is leaving. And that will continue to be part of the European idea, coming together and sharing ideas, also sharing commercial economic interest. The market, of course, will be a bit smaller, but even in Germany, and it's not a very popular issue, there is discussion even in our parliament who will be the next candidates to join the European Union. So the project will continue.
The thing is, yes, I think you're not affected. The great peaceful idea goes on. But there is, unrelated to the UK, unrelated to Brexit, there is a feeling that the EU project is stalling in terms of greater integration, particularly in the services sector, you know. I mean, it's very difficult to operate, you know, say, a mobile telephone company in France from Germany, because there are, you know, this protection, you know, in the service, all EU countries for protection. And there is therefore, you know, this suggestion that EU technology companies, for example, are not growing as well as those in the United States because of there not being greater integration in the services sector. Now, how do you, in the next phase of the EU's life, you know, address the services sector problem?
Can I answer the previous question before I answer this one? We have to remember, to keep in mind that the EU building started after the Second World War because we wanted to establish a long-lasting peace and economic development on the continent. And we started it without the UK at the beginning. The UK only joined the movement later in the 1970s, 20 years, more than 20 years after we started. And it remained a bit on the side. There are things that the UK did not join. They didn't join the common currency, the euro. They didn't join the, you know, the common
okay, Frederick, if
border.
I may just interrupt you. You can go on after. You know, we'll continue with this. We have to take a break right now, you know, and then we'll come back and you speak on that same point. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Notre rôle est de rétablir de la certitude et de la sécurité juridique là où la décision du Royaume-Uni de quitter l'Union crée de l'incertitude et de l'insécurité. Nous ne chercherons jamais à punir le Royaume-Uni. Jamais. We are entering uncharted waters. We are ready. Keep calm and negotiate.
Hello, welcome back. Frederick, I'm sorry you were rudely interrupted when you were in full flood about how the UK has been a reluctant partner of the EU, how they didn't join so many of the EU's initiatives.
what I meant by highlighting this past history is that the rest of the European Union has been sticking together quite nicely so far, and we will continue to do so. There's no less enthusiasm for the European project today than there was before. And what is left, I mean, the 27 member states represent 450 million people, which is still a very solid group of nations and people working together. As far as the next steps are concerned, we have plans to develop our policies and our common policies in a number of new sectors and new areas. The defense, the common protection is one, and we will continue to move gradually, slowly, but you've got to keep in mind that the European Union integration process is a gradual, step-by-step thing. This single market that we have today has been built from 27 different markets, putting together their resources, putting together their markets. Now it's extremely free in terms of circulation of goods, circulation of people. Yeah, any European citizen can go and live and work in any other European country. Services, most of them are also free in circulation. But there are few regulated areas which will gradually lift the barriers about. But the project, the European integration project, will continue step by step. We're moving forward, and our citizens, by and large, are still interested in the project. They believe in it. They trust the European Union more than they trust the national governments. It's quite interesting when we do opinion polls across the board. The level of trust in the European Union is higher on average than the level of trust for the citizens on their own governments. So there is hope. They're not satisfied. There would be propaganda to say that people are satisfied with the EU. But they pin hopes on this big thing, and they have the expectations, the expectation that we will do better at that level.
Well, the UK hasn't really had a happy relationship with the EU, has it? It's kind of a reluctant partner. And even at the early stages when they wanted to join the EEC, the French president said no a few times, in until they got it in 1962. It was President de Gaulle, So, it's a kind of like fog in the channel, continent isolated, sort of view which the UK has always had. And I mean, they put the UK first. And so, in a way, is this a natural outcome of a national predisposition of the British people?
I don't know. There's one element that in answer to that one is we've got in the EU treaty an Article 50 that allows countries to get out of the European Union. But you can also come back if you want at some point. I'm talking about long-term history here. But maybe at some point people will find that it's better to be in rather than out.
I understand your desire not to dwell, too much on the British exit as on the European future. The future continues. The future is there. British exit is a British problem now. There will be. We will discuss shortly the relationship between the two. But just still talking about the European idea. You mentioned defence, Frederick. Is, if I may ask you, Nikki, is the EU punching below its weight in foreign policy?
Not only in foreign policy, but in security policy as well. That's one more reason, and one very important reason why we would like to keep the UK as close to the US as possible. But this has been the case for a long time. The now incoming new president of the Commission, the German politician Ursula von der Leyen, was our defense minister until recently. She grew up in Brussels. So her father used to work for the EU before becoming a successful politician in Germany. She's really well prepared, and she knows a thing or two about defense matters. When she talks about a European army, which has been a catchword for a long time, she of course knows very well how difficult this
She has 7 children,
And she has seven children.
An army in itself.
Yes, she does. So projects like European Army are long-term projects, always have been, but it's quite clear that that the European Union, which is a heavyweight when you look at the numbers, must find a way to act as a heavyweight too. That's what many outsiders expect from us. It's not always popular. In fact, it's particularly difficult, I think, in my country, in Germany, to convince the voters that you need to spend on security and military matters, that you need to have a active foreign policy, that with success comes responsibility.
It's interesting that, from say a Malaysian perspective, in terms of European EU foreign policy, there are areas where we feel, I think, a certain convergence, a certain commonality. I suppose in respect of the Palestinian problem, I mean, you take quite an independent view from the United States, for example, towards Israel and Palestinian reunification or actually a two-state solution and the occupation issues and so on and so forth. On the other hand, there are certain other issues, as to be expected, where there are divergences. I mean, there's one, of course, hot one, which is hot almost literally because of the haze and what have you, to do with the oil palm industry. And one of the things the Malaysian Prime Minister, has done with the UK is you don't take the EU view on palm oil, right, or diesel, palm oil, to be used for the automobile industry and so on. So how would this pan out, in terms of EU policy, this particular aspect of EU policy on the environment? How would it go forward with Malaysia and Indonesia, for that matter?
If I linking this question with your previous question, the European Union is actually a big player worldwide, and it's not always felt this way. People don't always realize that we're a big player. If you look at the ASEAN, the European Union is actually the second largest trading partner with the ASEAN, and we are the largest foreign direct investor in the ASEAN. But people don't realize, because we come as different countries. If you take us all together, we're actually a very big partner to the region. And it's the same for Malaysia. And it's the same in the palm oil sector, by the way. We are the second largest client for Malaysian palm oil worldwide, behind India, but ahead of China. And we continue to buy. In the first half of 2019, our imports of palm oil from Malaysia grew by 6%. So the situation we have at the moment is that we have subsidized palm oil in continental Europe, by the way, not anymore in the UK. The UK does not subsidize palm oil as a biofuel. So we have subsidized palm oil as a biofuel for a long time, more than 10 years. We are the only ones in the world to do that. We are going to withdraw gradually these subsidies, but the market will remain open. There will be no ban against palm oil in Europe. So this is one of the elements of our relationship with Malaysia and Indonesia. We're looking at that very carefully. We're listening very closely to what Malaysia and Indonesia tell us. We're very clear that we're not closing the market, but changing our subsidy policy. And apart from that, palm oil is roughly 5% of Malaysia's exports to the European Union. The rest is growing very, very quickly and very large. Malaysia has a very large trade surplus in its relationship with the European Union. So there's plenty of good, solid opportunities for Malaysia on the European markets, which will continue to grow.
I mean, Nikki, you always have spoken on this point that Frederick touched upon, the extent of EU, in particular German, of course, from your perspective, investment in Malaysia, in ASEAN, which is not often recognized, often realized, and then therefore not recognized. How going forward now, you have made investments in the UK, before and so on. Would you be redirecting investments elsewhere because UK has left, and the economies of scale may not be the same anymore. The tariff rates coming back may be too high, so you might then therefore redirect your investments to other parts of the world, Malaysia or ASEAN. Would that such a realignment happen, do you think, in terms of investment?
Now, first of all, and that might disappoint you, but the German government doesn't direct investment. Businesses do, markets do, of course, but also changing political situations. That's one of the great advantages of Malaysia, and the reason why so many German, but also other foreign investors have been here for decades. Political stability, rules-based, in the end British law, if you like, and so Malaysia became the biggest investment destination for German companies in the whole of Southeast Asia. That is changing now because Vietnam is passing left and right. I think Malaysia should have an eye on what Vietnam is doing. Many German companies are now going to Vietnam. There are German companies leaving China. That's, to me, another opportunity for Malaysia to attract these companies. There are some positive examples there too, but in general, nothing much is changing. I don't think that Brexit has any serious effect on the Malaysian economy or on Malaysia as an investment destination. It might make Malaysia, if you do the right moves, more attractive. That's quite possible. The whole world is competing for foreign direct investment. Even we are not investing enough at home, a bit like Malaysian businesses. But we are one of the biggest exporters of capital worldwide. So our money is constantly looking for places to go to. Malaysia is still in a pretty good position.
It's interesting. So, whilst it is true that governments don't direct the direction of investment, private sector people make such decisions. The good relationships, between governments and between areas, give a sense of confidence, apart from the particular political stability factors of particular countries or region. But good relationships obviously provide a encouragement, for such investment flows. So when we talk about foreign relations, I mean, obviously, foreign relations will depict or evidence, good relationships, and there are areas in which there is a common ground, and areas in which there'll be sort of differences. By and large, the common ground areas exceed the differences, and palm oil is a problem. Area where there's misunderstanding. I think, Frederick, you took the opportunity to describe the situation in its perspective, So we mentioned, say, Palestinian issue. There must be some warmth, that there is a commonality. But there's also the issue of Muslims, Muslims in Europe. And rightly or wrongly, countries like Malaysia follow this, because of the Ummah, and the commonality and so on. What is the position in Europe in terms of migration, in terms of integration of the Muslim community into the different societies? What is it going to look like going forward, given that the Muslim population is multiplying, much faster than the local population? I mean, France has got a huge population of Muslims. Many of them came as citizens. Algerians, for example, were French citizens who came to France. So what is going to happen? This is another area that could cause, a disturbance in relations.
I don't, not at all. I completely disagree with you, Munir. Honestly, France has the largest Muslim population in Europe. It's 5-6 million people. It's maybe 8% of our population. We don't have official statistics because we never ask people, what is your religion? That's part of our protection of our privacy. But roughly, we've got 5-6 million Muslims in France, and it's a relatively new religion in our countries. It's a religion that came with migration over the past century, gradually. And of course, with all new cultural elements in a society and new migrations, there are difficulties in integration. People come with a lower background in terms of education level and all these things. And there is an element of discrimination and of identity protection and things like this. So we're fighting against discrimination. We're trying very hard to integrate the new migrant populations that arrive. But most Muslims in France are French citizens. They have the nationality. Yeah, we don't see it as a problem. We see it as part of our society. And now we see our societies as multi-religious, multicultural societies, with questions of living together, which we have across the world, including in Malaysia, by definition.
But some Muslims cause problems, you know, those who are terrorists, for example, you know, and then the non-Muslim people, you know, may identify Muslims with terrorism. There is an obvious challenge that society faces, whatever society. I think people who have come to Germany, you know, Nikki, I mean, there have been instances of violent action, you know. So how do you handle this kind of issues? You know, it's a difficult issue to handle, and terrorism is a global threat, but you know, it would seem that the Muslims, some Muslims, you know, have been involved in this terrorism. How do you differentiate, you know, to your populace, the difference between the terrorists and the Muslims proper?
Now, as you know, the situation in Germany is different from the French situation. We too have several million Muslims living in Germany, mostly people of Turkish descent who've been living there third, even fourth generation. We've never had any problems with that. We have maybe not always been so successful in integrating these people for different reasons, but most of them are by now German citizens living in Germany. I believe we still take pretty good care of refugees coming to Germany. Refugees mostly coming from Syria or Afghanistan, sometimes also Iraq. That's another group. And then there are migrants. That is relatively new to us. Legal and often, of course, illegal migrants coming from North Africa or mostly then West Africa, many of whom do not and will not get the right to stay. That is probably the real issue for our politics, because these are people who cannot and often do not want to be integrated in the German society. And then it gets difficult. Terrorism is, in fact, in Germany a minor issue. I believe that when you look at the past 50 years, most terrorists in Germany were actually German citizens. Remember the Red Army faction in the 1970s. That's not really an issue. The issue is how do you integrate foreigners in the German society, and that is something relatively new to us. We had to learn this. We are trying from other countries who are much more experienced. France is one of them, but then the real immigration countries like Canada, Australia, US, we can learn from them. We are now running out of German teachers, for example. We found out how important it is that people learn the German language, but that's improving. I think a very general remark, the sad truth is most of the victims of Muslim terrorism are Muslims themselves.
This is interesting, though. I think Germany, France, you know, have got a pretty clear, you know, policy on immigrants, on integration, and so on. But looking at it from a distance, Europe as a whole, EU as a whole, you might identify countries like Hungary now, no, Austria, you know, as being rather hostile. You know, is this a correct perception? Because it is EU we're talking about here, you know.
I think it's correct to say that we don't have a very strong common policy towards migration. That's one of the issues we've been facing these past years. The only thing that would be common in a way is the fact that at the moment the European Union as a whole is not really open to migrations. We're not like Australia or the US or Canada. We're not a place which tells the rest of the world, come because we want more people. That's not the situation we are in. We're in a situation where for quite a number of decades we've had a high level of unemployment, and the feeling is, let's deal with unemployment first. Let's make sure that the people who are here can live better before we take in more people. But on this basis, I think migrations come, and in particular political migration because of refugee flux, and that's part of it.
We'll take a break now, and I think it'd be interesting in the next discussion to take this up and then enlarge it to EU relations, in the future with Britain, with the United States, with China, with ASEAN. Okay, we'll take a break now.
Mm-hmm.
How young people abroad view the UK before and after Brexit. We asked polling firm Ipsos Mori to carry out 2 surveys to find out what young people from the G20 nations thought of the UK before and after its vote to leave the European Union. There was good news. Overall, the survey showed that the UK is perceived very well. It's in joint 4th place with France, behind Canada, Australia and Italy. The overall attractiveness of the UK didn't change. Nearly 3 in 4 people said they found the UK attractive. But there were big differences between countries. The EU countries surveyed were generally gloomier about their future engagement with the UK. Young people in Germany, France and Italy viewed the UK more negatively. There was a 19% net negative impact on the UK's attractiveness, which is concerning for the country's reputation in the EU. On the other hand, the Commonwealth countries and the rest of the G20 said the vote to leave the EU made the UK more attractive. People still generally trusted the UK. They trusted the people more than the government. The UK came joint 4th with Japan as a country whose people can be trusted, behind Canada, Australia and Germany. But fewer people thought after the vote that the UK values diversity, is open and welcoming and tolerant. Fewer people also thought that the UK government works constructively with others, treats people in the UK fairly, or gives its fair share of aid. Despite the UK being only one of 2 countries in the G7 to spend the full target amount on aid in 2016. Our study shows that people in the UK are still well liked, but if the next generation overseas consistently sees them as less open and welcoming, the attractiveness of the UK may suffer.
Welcome back. Actually, Frederick, I interrupted you again, in full flood. But before you continue on what you're saying, interestingly, we are being watched, and so there are a few questions, that have come, and there's very, very interesting ones, And one was something you mentioned, Frederick, before we started this program. So this brings it, if you like, to the current situation before we discuss relations, with other countries and so on in the future. The latest report says Boris Johnson has a final proposal to break the Brexit impasse. So the Independent newspaper describes it as a sort of take it or leave it offer. What's your take on this? Take it or leave it offer from Boris Johnson, if there was such a proposal made. And this is very interesting.
First of all, it's good that the UK has a proposal, because we've been waiting for a long time for the UK to give us some idea of how we would get a new deal. Second, the European Union is of course ready to renegotiate the deal that we had. We signed on and we negotiated successfully in November 2018. Remember, it was almost a year ago. But we are ready to renegotiate at this point in time. We don't have much time. We've got until the end of the month. Now, make or break. it's not the best way to come to a negotiating table to say this is my final word, I will not change. My feeling, my guess is there's probably a bit of leeway of discussion, but we don't know at this point what the proposal is and how acceptable it will be for the European Union, and in particular for Ireland, because that's going to be one of the main issues there, the border between Northern and Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
I think there should be no threats in a negotiation, should there? I mean, Nikki, yeah.
Well, no, not when it comes to negotiation between EU member states. We are members of the same club. So is still the UK. That's not the way we deal with each other. But there are many legendary night-long debates, discussions, negotiations in Brussels. Happens regularly. Very tough. Each member state pursues possibly different interests. So, if someone comes to the table saying this is my final proposal, it might be even quite clever negotiation tactics, but you only know afterwards.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ganesh, for that question. I have quite a few, but I like to take a question that will bring us back to future foreign policy, future relations. And there is actually a question as it happens on it. After Brexit, will the EU see Britain as the enemy in the political and economic sense?
Not at all. We will definitely continue to see the UK as a friend and an ally. The UK is a political, a security, a military ally to us, to both our countries. It has been for a long time and will continue to be one. So the objective for all of us is to keep the closest possible relationship with the UK after Brexit.
I think you would, I'm sure, echo that, won't you, Nikki?
Oh, absolutely, very much so. Now, France is, besides the UK, the only nuclear power in Europe. We only have two. We need both of them. It's very much in our interest to keep the UK as close to the EU as possible. It reminds me on one thing. Which language is being spoken in Brussels? Answer: bad English. That is not going to change in the EU. No, we have every interest to keep London as close to us as possible.
Some of the questions that have come up have been issues that we have actually addressed. For example, you had spoken, Nikki, about the car parts that come from the UK to the EU, and then of course the auto industry accounts for about 6%, according to Karim Ahmad from Shah Alam. 6% of EU employment and about 14 million jobs. So a no-deal Brexit means ending tariff-free trade with a market that takes 57% of British car exports. This is a parts exports we're talking about that would snarl the supply chains, you said, and that could cause problems and disrupt production, erode profit margins. So there will be these kinds of swings and roundabouts, this kind of costs.
But that's not really new. When you look at the EFTA states, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, they're not member of the European Union. Some of them don't want to be a member of the European Union. Still, they are very, very close to the market. Yes, maybe there will be tariffs. What do tariffs do? Well, tariffs, often unnecessary, raise the costs. Yeah? But it doesn't mean that there is no trade. It's just getting a little bit more expensive.
Can I even go further than that? Even in the case of a no-deal solution by the 31st of October, what we will start on the 1st of November is a negotiation on a free trade agreement between the European Union and the UK. Right. So there will be a transitory period where all the tariffs will apply on both sides, maybe, but then we will have an FTA at some point which will bring the UK in roughly the same situation in terms of tariffs and exchanges as we have the situation we have with Norway or Switzerland.
As we're coming to the end of our discussion, as I promised, I said, we want to discuss about your relationship with others. We discussed Britain obliquely and directly already. Now, about the United States, President Trump is not a big fan of the EU, right? And that makes relations with the United States rather difficult. Whilst he's in power, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Investment and Trade, Free Trade Organization is dead. That was supposed to be EU and so on. Britain will likely sort of consolidate the Anglo-Saxon relationship under Trump, certainly. So what is the EU perception of the Americans? What is the relationship likely to be with the Americans? Assuming President Trump continues and gets re-elected, can you give us a sense of how you view the EU relationship with the US in the future?
If you ask me, I hope that we continue to view the United States as by far the most important, of course, the strongest ally when it comes to security issues. Possibly still the most attractive, but also most competitive markets. If you make it in the American market, you can make it anywhere. It is attractive. Also, what comes to my mind is, if you look at the per capita income in the United States, which is continuously about a third, sometimes 50% higher than in the EU, there's maybe something that we could actually learn from some. Not all economic and financial policies in the United States. And this is the case actually regardless who is inhabiting the White House.
I would certainly agree with this idea. We will continue to be very close trading partners, and the relationship between the US and the EU is also through companies, people. Even on some of the very touchy issues like climate change, you find that you've got a federal government in Washington who says, I don't want to work on climate change, but at the level of states in the United States and companies and cities, a lot of people who are still on board together with us, trying to find ways of fighting climate change in the world. So this will continue to be a very close relationship.
The two of you are obviously first-class diplomats. Okay? You've not mentioned Trump at all, in reply to the question of his rather sometimes antagonistic attitudes towards the EU, his support of Brexit, no-deal Brexit, his support of an aggressive negotiating stance, by Britain. It must be a difficult issue in the foreign ministries of your countries, as well as in Brussels, is it not?
Oh, I'm sure it is. It is often a difficult issue for companies, for economists. American companies, the American economy is very competitive, and when this is reinforced by aggressive trade policies coming from Washington, of course that's difficult to deal with. In some cases, it has already forced the EU to act. If it forces the European Union to think about tariffs and taxes and all the rest of it, it might actually be advantageous to the European consumer. Who knows? But this is life. This is realpolitik. We have to deal with it, and we do. It's not the first time that an American president finds it maybe a bit complicated to understand the truly complicated European Union. The American system is completely different from the European system, so there's bound to be some misunderstandings every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Yes, especially with Trump, there will be misunderstandings, I suppose. Let's move to China. Your relationship with China, it is, you have, again, pluses and minuses like everywhere else, but the human rights issues, and of course right now particularly the Hong Kong protests, these things always come to color your relationship with China. How do you manage these things as diplomats, foreign policy advisors? How do you manage an interest, concern over human rights without damaging, you know, the underlying relationship and interests, particularly economic and business ones with China? I mean, the French are quite adept at this, are they?
Human, I don't know. Human rights, as you say, color our foreign policy not only towards China but towards the whole world. The point in building the European Union at the very beginning was to establish a stable democracy within the borders of the European continent, because we knew what it meant to have sudden dictatorships coming up, and it ends in conflict for us in the European Union. That's our experience of the Second World War. So democracy, we think, is valid for us. So we tend to think that it's also interesting for the rest of the world, and we've got this humanistic, universal vision of human rights. So as you say, it colors our foreign policy everywhere. Sometimes it comes antagonistic with our economic interests, and it's a question of balance. But China has been a big partner for the European Union, a strategic partner for the European Union for a long time. Of course, a country of 1.3 billion people is essential to discuss and be in dialogue with. I think dialogue is probably the key word on this human rights issue. But we certainly would like China to make progress on the human rights front. There's nothing we can do or impose from the outside. Everything will have to come from inside China itself. It will be their decision.
I think from the EU perspective also, in terms of economic relationships, there are certain standards, you know, that you insist on in terms of transparency, in terms of disclosure, you know, financial propriety, you know, that can affect and does affect things like the BRI. You know, there have been a rail line from Budapest to Belgrade has been reopened because of the award of contracts without proper tender processes. Now, this specifically would also affect your relationship with China. Apart from human rights, you have the standards, you know, standard procedures, SOPs that you have, you know, for contracts. So how are you going to negotiate around this kind of issues with China? And we had to do it in Malaysia with ECRL and what have you. I mean, the EU has got, you know, more contracts of that nature to negotiate with China, Nikkei. How do you think that's coming along?
Well, on the political level, we regularly ask China to respect the unity of the European Union, just as we respect the unity, the One China policy. They have been doing this for now, what, 40 years almost, because that has become an issue. When it comes to standards, well, the underlying or overarching standard of human rights. I remember just a few years ago a now former German foreign minister standing next to the foreign minister of another big country simply said, just to avoid a misunderstanding, human rights is not a Western concept, it's a global concept. It applies to all of us and anywhere. Of course, there is the question of a balance, sometimes a conflict between economic interest and human rights. That continues to be difficult, case by case. In part, this is why you have diplomats.
Finally, ASEAN, you know, ASEAN. When will there be an FTA, EU-ASEAN FTA, free trade agreement? It's been negotiated for donkey's years, you know. What is the problem? When would there, or could there be?
We started about 10 years ago with the idea of negotiating an EU-ASEAN FTA with the ASEAN as a whole. We quite quickly realized that it would not be possible because the ASEAN was not ready. So we agreed to negotiating with countries one by one. We have signed already an FTA with Vietnam and one with Singapore. We're negotiating with Indonesia. And now, Malaysia, we certainly hope that we will restart the negotiation. And the objective and the aim is still for us to have an EU-ASEAN FTA if we can. But it also depends on the level of integration and ability of ASEAN member states to get together and have this negotiation together.
Well, I think that's about the time we have for this discussion, and I would like to thank very much His Excellency, the Ambassador of Germany to Malaysia, Nicolas Graf Lambsdorff, and also His Excellency, the French Ambassador to Malaysia, Frédéric Laflanche, for spending time with us to discuss the issue. And as you can see, when we discuss Brexit, it is not just about Britain. It's more about the EU and the future of the EU as well. Well, thank you very much, and bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.